Good, you ready? All right, welcome everyone to our celebration for our 100th anniversary. Today we're honoring our faculty member, Kay Dickersin. And may I announce your retirement? So Dr. Dickersin is retiring at the end of this calendar year. So we're grateful for her service to the department, and we wish her all the best as she moves toward retirement. So welcome to all of you to this seminar today. So we will have our usual seminar time, so 12:15. We'll have some introductions, and then Kay will deliver her seminar. And we'll have some time for questions and answers. And then we have a reception starting at 1:30. That'll be in the Anna Bacher room, which is 10:30. So our department has a long and illustrious history. Yesterday I was at the National Cancer Institute, and so many of the people there talked about how great our department is and congratulated us on our 100th anniversary. We've already had one of these celebrations of our faculty, so Dr. Moises Sklo, we celebrated in September. Today we're honoring Kay Dickersin. We have two more during our 100th anniversary year. The next one will be Dr. Nelson. We'll celebrate him, and we're hoping that he'll be able to attend, and so that'll be great. So we understand that he's cognitively engaged, and so he may be able to join us. We're hopeful for that. And then in April, Dr. Ibrahim, will celebrate him and his time in our department and his contributions to the field. On December 6th, we'll have another department celebration, and this is for all of us to come together and just enjoy. I hear we're going to have a hot chocolate bar, believe it or not, and it'll be super exciting, along with some tasty sort of light fare. So again, today we're honoring Dr. Dickersin. She's going to present a talk called Making Decisions That Matter. And introducing Dr. Dickersin is Dr. Tian Jing Li, an associate professor in the department. Tian Jing?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tian Jing Li. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Epidemiology. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce my mentor and colleague, Professor Kay Dickersin. Kay needs no introduction, as her many scientific contributions speak to her impact to the field of clinical trials, evidence synthesis, epidemiology, and public health. Of the many scientific accomplishments, one most well-known being that Kay obtained the first direct evidence of publication bias as part of her thesis. So she wrote in a landmark JAMA article in 1990 that if treatment decisions are based on the published literature, then the literature must include all available data that are of acceptable quality. Currently, obtaining information regarding all studies undertaken in a given field is difficult, even impossible. Registration of clinical trials and perhaps other types of studies is the direction in which the scientific community should move. As you can tell, Kay was ahead of her time, and she helped shape thinking in the field. This was more than a decade before clinical trial registries, such as clinicaltrials.gov, came about. Her work is a major reason behind why clinical trials are registered these days. These registries help prevent the problems identified in her thesis. That's just one example of Kay's impact. She was a founder of the Cochrane Collaboration, a major global player in the evidence synthesis arena. She served as president of the Society for Research Synthesis and Methodology between 2016 and 2017, and was awarded the Ingram Oking Award for Lifetime Achievement in Research Synthesis Methods in 2014. Kay was elected to the Institute of Medicine, now called the National Academy of Medicine, in 2007. Within the Department of Epidemiology, Kay has served as a director for the Center for Clinical Trials and Evidence Synthesis since 2005. She has been tireless in developing the track curriculum. When she was recruited, there was just one course, Introduction to Clinical Trials. Now, there's an array of courses, live and remote. Kay has earned her bachelor's degree in zoology and master's degree in cell biology from the University of California at Berkeley. She taught college biology in California before entering the epidemiology PhD program at our school in 1979, studying under Dr. Kurt Meinert. She served on the faculty at University of Maryland from 1990 to 1998, Brown University from 1998 to 2005, and returned to Hopkins in 2005. Kay views her scientific contributions as an integral part of her life, which you will hear from her lecture today. Her work has been a lot, but her life has been a lot more than her work. And now I'm going to share with you a story. So have you ever been to the SLT Island? Here is a lovely picture of the island. Nice sandy beach, with wild roaming horses, idyllic and romantic. I used to organize this annual camping trip to SLT Island. These beautiful horses, tough and wild, they like sticking their nose into your campsite and take advantage of a free meal. They will fearlessly, trample through your supplies looking for food, where you're there or not. And when the horse panics, they can run anywhere, including over you. So I would say sometimes the best relationship is a long-distance relationship, certainly true with the wild animals. So let me ask a question. How many of you have you ever been chased by a horse? Some of us. Okay, so if that's the case, you might as well just Google how to repel horses before being chased, okay? But that is not a problem when you have Professor Dickersin on your team. So she was cool, she was resourceful, she grabbed pans, pots, spoons, scissors, literally anything that can make a noise to scare the horses away. Okay, so here's how the horses ran away. Okay. So this picture reminds me of the Fearless Girl statue in New York City, where the plaque on the ground actually says, "Know the power of women in leadership. She makes a difference." So Kay is more to us than the science she does. She is cool, imaginative, inspiring, fearless, and deeply loved. Today, we're here to celebrate Kay's outstanding prowess and global impact as a researcher, a teacher, a mentor, and a woman. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kay Dickersin.
I'd forgotten about that. Thank you. That was really quiet. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Tian Jing. So I don't know if you all know it, but Tian Jing came from China, an unknown student, recommended by the head of the Chinese Cochrane Collaboration. Okay. And she's just her own person and a fantastic researcher, and thank you so much. That was really nice. So thank you. I'm not sure I can live up to all of that, but anyway, thank you all for being here, and I see lots of friendly faces, and I don't dare say old, but that I've known a long time, including all those years ago that were mentioned by Elizabeth. All right, now I've got to figure this all out. Okay, so this talk is called Making Decisions That Matter, and I saw in Michelle Obama's new book, this quote from her, "The universal challenge of squaring who you are with where you come from and where you want to go." And that really spoke to me. I don't know if it speaks to all of you. Take what you want from it or not. But it is, for me, who am I anyway, and how does that square with my work? Because as Tian Jing said and others, my work is my life, and my life is my work. It's all one for me. It doesn't have to be for everyone, but it is. So I'll tell you a story. I've interspersed some stories, and they're in red here because I thought, well, I have to remember to tell the story, and I thought, well, I'll tell you a story's coming. So this briefcase is was given to me by my mother when my second child was born while I was a student here, Eddie. And she said, you have to stop carrying diapers so everybody can see what they are. We didn't have pictures of our kids or our husband on our desk. We sort of kept our family life separate in those days. And she said, so she got me a briefcase along with my father for, I forget if it was my birthday or Christmas, but around when my second son was born. She said, this'll hide the diapers and you can carry your work too. So that's been my life, is hiding the diapers. Okay, so I hear a lot of students talk about their career path, and I just want to say that it's not separate for me, career path. There's your life, and you have to make decisions every step of the way, whether you move in with someone you care about or whether you do something related to work. Life looks more like this. It's not a path, it's life. And it really looks like this. And so I hope what I described to you is you can follow. But again, take what you want from it. So I'm going to present some key themes, but just so you can remember something, because I'm going to say a lot. And these are the key themes. Be who you are. And most of all, make it part of your work. It's okay to be who you are. And in my case, I'm a woman. And that's part of my work. And feminism is part of my work. And it just is, because it's a lot easier that way. But be open to other perspectives, too, because they're incredibly important. It enriches your thinking to be open to those perspectives. And then translate what you do to others, so that you're sure that your work has impact. And I'm sure everyone these days is hearing, well, what's the impact? And I know the first time I was asked that by a project officer, I just laughed. I said, well, I wish we could tell what the impact of the clinical trials are that we're doing. It's really hard to know if we're having any impact. But you have to search for that evidence of impact, because that's what really makes a difference. We aren't doing this for ourselves. We're doing this for the world. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today are the risk factors that I believe are associated with good outcomes in my life. Gender, or in my case, being a woman, education, following the thread of your interest. The unexpected, believe it or not, can lead to good things. Friends, very important, and some of them become collaborators, and your collaborators are important too. Talking all the time and listen to others. When you go up in the elevator, talk to people. Find out what they're thinking about. It can influence you. Experiencing for real. All the experiences, I'll talk about them, because it's important to do, not just sit at our desks as we tend to do these days, me included. Maintain a balance in your life, whatever that is, and it changes. All these things change over time. What this is today doesn't mean this is what it'll be 10 years from now or 20 years from now. Pay attention to what's happening elsewhere, and choose your work by the people you like, not by the work you like, by the people you like, because that's where you're going to have to work your whole life. Okay, so let's start with gender and being a woman. I should say, to start out, I really am glad I'm a woman. And for all you men, I hope you're glad you're a man too. But I'm really glad to be a woman. And one of the things that I like is having a family, having kids, having a husband. So just to give you some background here. So I have a partner who's here today named Bob, and he's very kind and incredibly supportive. And Jimmy told me this green wouldn't show up, but I can see it. And they all say, well, we know what Bob looks like anyway. So here he is. I just wanted to make sure you knew who Bob was and that I wasn't marrying his best man. So those are our families. And I was 21 and he was 23. And as you see, the dogs got into the picture too. The kids are very important. I had one kid when I started here, and I had another during my, I guess, the beginning of the second year. And they're very important. And I'll tell you a story that I was reminded of because of Thanksgiving, which just passed. But I was clearing the plates for Thanksgiving, I would say they were a little older than this picture. They were probably in high school because I can remember the house. And I was clearing the plates and they were out having an argument in the kitchen, and they argue all the time still. And the older one was shaking his finger at the younger one. He said, "Don't you know, Eddie, that association does not mean causation?" I thought I really had made it. He was listening to me. Kids don't listen to you too much. You know that if you're a parent. So grandkids have made a big difference to me too. Here are my grandkids. And recently, my granddaughter, who's 13 now, said, "I hate math," which, as some of you might remember, is what Barbie said. And that was very bad for women, especially those of us in epidemiology who theoretically all liked math. But anyway, and I was happy to see an article in the paper this week about Jarrett Allen at the MBA who said, "Math is the future." I thought, wow, this is great. Anyway, she gets an A in math. So I said to her, this is her grandmother talking, "I hope your grandmother said something like this to you. Do math. You don't have to become a mathematician, but you're good at math. Do math. Just, don't hate it because it's fun." And of course, I love my family of origin, my in-laws, everybody, all these friends. And just have fun with being a woman or a girl. I'll be various things today. So just to orient some of you, I know from talking, especially to the young people, that things are different now. And I was part of an era where in the 50s and 60s, we were really brought up to be good wives and mothers. And Bobby and I, when we went on site visits early on, we'd leave dinners for our husbands. You didn't hear that, Bob. He said, "Don't ask me what I eat. It's healthy." But the kids told me the story. Anyway, we really wanted to be good wives and mothers. This is what we were supposed to be. But now I think women just want to be good people, and that's how it should be. So that's great. But you'll hear a lot of stuff that maybe isn't part of your life, but was part of mine. And that's part of that Michelle Obama quote is, "Whether the past predicts the future." And I wonder it myself. I was the oldest of 5 children. My father was a doctor, my mother a school teacher in the city of Boston. And I was one of 4 sisters, and my brother was the youngest. There he is. He's about 2 at the New York World's Fair. I went to an all-girls school, which, was, we had a good education, let's put it that way. I loved the Beatles. They were a central part of growing up. And this is my Beatle box. It has all the pictures that I had of them, the movie magazines, the baseball cards, their autographs, tickets to their concerts. Really, they were very important to me. And so was the peace movement that was part of growing up, because we had a lot of protests. We drove through Baltimore. We went to Washington. And just reliving that, the good and also the bad, was part of growing up. And then after that, I went first to a women's college, dropped out because it was obvious I wanted to do science, and it wasn't the right place for me. It was heavily into the arts. And I transferred then to Berkeley, as you heard, and did science, cell biology, and got married in college to Bob, and then had kids about 3 years later, had my first kid, and I read this pamphlet at that time called The Cultural Warping of Childbirth. And it was by Doris Hare, and it was published in 1972, and it was all evidence-based medicine about having a baby. I was just blown away. I loved it. And it wasn't called evidence-based medicine then, but it was about what's the evidence for all these things we do during childbirth. It was very interesting. So I couldn't find my pamphlet when I was taking these pictures, and I wrote a couple of friends, They produced them like that. So obviously it had meaning for other people too. Okay, so I told you I went to a girls' school. What was the good and the bad? Well, the good was that we had great math. I even took linear algebra in high school, if you can believe it, which is a wonderful setup for all of us. And they taught us about critical thinking, which I protested about a fair amount, but we had to learn it. And there were no male distractions. The bad was there was no science. We didn't have any science teachers. We had to go to the boys' school across the street to take science. They wanted us to get into college, but there were no science teachers. And it was very confusing. What were the expectations? Because they said, you're really smart, you're going to do something, but they were teaching us to give teas and raise money for social services and so forth. So it was very confusing. And the bad was there were no male distractions, which I would have liked. So the impact was the critical thinking was excellent, and really we were taught by women teachers mostly, and the guy teachers were pretty good, that girls were smart and capable, and that was a really good message. So I think education's really important too, but education is more than going to school. It's your mentors. In this case, there's Dr. Meinert. He's that tall guy, second from the left. And two of my other mentors that I'll talk about a little later, Ian Chalmers and Tom Chalmers and me down at the Smithsonian. It was our first meeting of our study on publication bias. So I think that the people that we're in contact with is a great and important part of our education. I also think reading's incredibly important. And this is a poster I gave to one of our kids when he was growing up. He's now given it to his daughter. And Yoda says we should all read. I say read. And experiences are part of education too, as you all know. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. So anyway, then I went into cell biology after transferring out of the girls' college, the women's college that I went to. And I went there to do art, by the way, and as soon as I was there, I realized I wasn't very good. But I wasn't very good at science either, because we hadn't had it in high school. And I remember our teacher in college talking about the central dogma. I said, what's that? And they talked about learning DNA off of cereal boxes. And I thought, well, I sure didn't. You know, our cereal boxes, for one thing, were about 5 years old. But anyway, in cell biology, which I loved and where I majored and then did my master's degree at Berkeley, we just had fantastic learning constant. And a lot of it was talking and reading. And I had great mentors who I'm still in touch with, many of them today, including one of them, a friend mentor who does cell biology still in eyes. And so that was a wonderful connection. And we didn't know it then that that's what we do it. The bad was that because I hadn't had science in high school, I just really wasn't good enough. That was the truth. And it took nights and weekends. I didn't see how I was going to do that with kids, taking off gels in the middle of the night. Very few women. There were 3 of us in 3 labs, and there were tons of men. And, you know, it just wasn't suitable at that time. And it was pretty sexist environment, which, you know, we just accepted. But I see now, oh boy, glad I got out. In epidemiology, which I then did after 5 years, it had wonderful learning possible. And Sukhan, I don't know if you recognize yourself. You're here with me. It's right after my orals, my preliminary orals. And they were coming in to take pictures of us in the Frost room for the phone book, which then was a book. And Sukhan came in. He's instructing me, I think, on the Poisson distribution or something. And I don't know who the woman is. Maybe you do. And it's a very creative field. It's wonderful that way. And the field was half women, which I love. Bad is, it really does take nights and weekends, just the same as cell biology. And there was no daycare. And Michael Taryn and another woman and I, and Michael's here today, we all were pregnant at the same time. And we fought like mad to get daycare here. And we thought we had it all fixed up, and it didn't work out at the end. I'm happy to tell that story if you're interested. But we had T-shirts made, and we hoped we'd have daycare here, but I think the first daycare came to Hopkins when our kids were about 30. And we even had bumper stickers made that said, Harvard 11, Hopkins 0. What are we talking about? Daycare. Anyway, also there is sexism. It's more subtle here, but it exists. So, for example, the department, you are going to be amazed at this, was very small in 1979 when I arrived. There were only 10 professors, and 2 of them were women. Bernice Cohen, who did genetics, and Jean Matinowski, who's still here. And you've seen some of these names. Kurt Meinert, still here. And really, it's Kurt and Jean now. Okay, following the thread. So I asked Bobby, I said, what should I talk about? And she said, well, talk about publication bias. And it turns out there are lots of threads that I followed up on, and you'll hear about some of them. But that was a major thread, as Tian Jing said. And it's how is practice, clinical practice, guided by research? So the path went something like this. My master's advisor and bachelor's advisor was Dan Mazia at Berkeley, who did cell biology. He's the guy who figured out mitosis and calcium and so forth. And I sort of made up a quote and put quotations around it, but those are my words, really. And I found a job right after my master's degree, and he said, well, that's great you have a job, but it probably means you won't publish your findings. And I never did. So, and then I came here after 5 years. Kurt was my advisor, not my first advisor, but he became my advisor because I was very interested in clinical trials. And he was too. And I listened to the things Tian Jing said, and really Kurt Meinert, I mean, so much of this is his inspiration because he was interested in clinical trials and registration and IRBs and a lot of the things that we followed up on. So he really was an inspiration and part of that important path. And you can see he's wearing a hat that says the boss. He also had a whip in his office for what he called gradual students, of which I was one. I was really a gradual student because then after a year or so, I moved to Boston for 4 years. And that's part of being a woman, but we won't talk about that. And people would say, well, how was that? And I said, well, I'll tell you after in maybe 10 or 20 years, I'll know. And it was a good move, as it turns out, because at that time, Tom Chalmers was doing his sabbatical there from New York City. And I had seen him at the Society for Clinical Trials. He was one of the founders. And he was very interested in something called meta-analysis. And which no one in medicine had heard about then. And he was on sabbatical, and I fell in with him, and he wanted me to do a thesis on aspirin. I said, no, I'm not interested in aspirin. But registers of trials, yeah, I'm very interested in that. So he said, well, I'm going to put you in touch with this Ian Chalmers guy who I've never met. We share the same last name, and he's over in Oxford, and he's doing a register of perinatal trials, published perinatal trials. And so maybe something can be worked out there. And so that was part of my path. And I wrote a lot of papers, and Kurt, again, was very supportive of a thesis being made up of published papers. And there were other departments in this school, but in the Epi department, this was the first thesis of published papers. There I am on graduation day. I did finally graduate 10 years later. Okay, so Dr. Sklo showed this slide when he spoke last month, or the month before, and he adapted it, he said, from John Samet. And what I really like how it incorporates publication as part of research, because that is part of research. We're often not funded for it, but it's there, and if we don't do it, then how are we transferring the knowledge that we've gained? So this is what he presented. In different places, biases can show up, and he talked about publication bias. Well, in fact, I would say there's much more after publication, like what's reported, where the study's reported, and whether that report is accessible. And this is where we've really focused, is these questions here, starting with publication bias, which really started with my thesis. And a lot of people have worked on this, so I'm just highlighting recent years. So whether a study is reported, you could look at publication bias, that is whether the results are related to whether a study is published in full or not, and factors that contribute to publication decisions, what's reported. The outcome can be manipulated so that you cherry pick what's reported. And Evan Mayo Wilson has been working especially on that with Tian Jing, and adverse events. And where it's reported, and I'm not going to tell you about some of the journals that were early online journals that we've now gotten made public so that other people can see that research, but where it's reported is very important. And Jimmy Lay is doing work with Riaz on predatory journals, and it turns out they're very difficult to access, because where a study is reported is very important, and whether that report is accessible. Conference abstracts, Bobby's done a lot of work there, clinical study reports, non-public, and how you search for studies, and the public availability of science, because I think that's what we're all about, is knowledge and how you gain knowledge, and that's where we've tried to focus. So a lot of people have worked on these topics. These are just some of them recently. So has this work had any impact? I'd like to think so. Nina Matheson, who was head of the Welch Library in the 80s and early 90s, she was on my thesis committee. And again, I can attribute that choice to Kurt Meinert. I think she's been very important in realizing that reporting biases are very important in this transmission of knowledge. And another important person is Deborah Zarin, who headed up clinicaltrials.gov until recently, for the last 13 years, and that's a major register of trials here in the U.S. They've been very important, but also other policy that's been made on the basis of our research has to do with broad searching now being required, and a lot of the medical subject headings, or MESH, have been changed in Medline so that they're better. Like when I started, the only way you could search for randomized trials was research design. Informationists and librarians being important collaborators, incredibly important collaborators, and they're not just a librarian, there are collaborators in research. And open science, I'd like to think that we contribute to open science as well, and Deborah Zarin certainly is carrying that on in her work now. So what about the unexpected? This played a surprisingly important role, and maybe you have to live 30 years to see how important it is, because I certainly didn't make it part of my research. And Lynn Wang, who's in our group, a PhD student, I was talking to her, remember, one of my risk factors is talk, one day, because I had read that this quote we all know, or idea we all know, that crisis and opportunity are part of the same Chinese character. I read, it's not true at all. And so I was saying, well, what is true? And she said, well, there was this, the guy who founded the Taoism, Lao Tzu, I hope I know I'm not doing tones, but let's hope I'm getting close enough anyway. He said that good fortune follows disaster. So if you're in some disaster, good fortune will follow. But don't get too complacent, because disaster will come. It lurks within good fortune. So both are true. And I really like that idea because I think that's been true in this particular case, the unexpected. When I was a graduate student in the department, 34 years old, I had 2 kids, 6 and 10. I was diagnosed with invasive breast cancer. And at that time, I was sure I was going to die. I'm still here. It's amazing. Anyway, believe it or not, it didn't have anything to do with my research, but it has led me to really respect something. I'll tell you a little bit about it. So because I was a breast cancer survivor, I helped to found a study here in Baltimore, not a study, see, I'm just so oriented to studies, a group here in Baltimore for coping with breast cancer, really, called Arm in Arm. And we started that in 1987. And then we got an invitation, did we want to get bigger? Did we want to help out, make this a bigger story? And yeah, sure. So we went to Washington and helped to found, I was one of the founding mothers of the National Breast Cancer Coalition. They didn't have any scientists in those days. I was about to graduate and go over to a department of ophthalmology at University of Maryland. And I had a wonderful chair who said, sure, you can do breast cancer. Okay. Anyway, and then since I was the only scientist and Sue Love was the only surgeon on the board, I kept getting called down to Washington to, fill in about the science. I said, wait a minute, you guys are all smart. We're going to educate the whole board about science. And then when we did that, we said, well, let's just take this on the road and educate more people about science so that advocates can become scientists as well. We don't want them to become science, but know the language so it's not intimidating, and become our partners in research and in systematic reviews now. And I'll show you some of our partners there. And that led to starting CUE, or Consumers United for Evidence-Based Healthcare, which we've had since 2004 in our group. And this is a coalition of consumer groups, not just breast cancer, but all groups. Anyone can join as long as they aren't primarily funded by pharmaceutical companies. And they're interested in evidence, of course. So I'll tell you that story. This was first when we did Project LEAD, which stood for Leadership, Education, and Advocacy Development. And we started that in 1995. And you can see Steve Goodman, who was in the department. He was a teacher in Project LEAD. Francis Collins, head of NIH, was our first teacher. And it's developed into an online course now, which followed a medical school teaching course I was doing, and that's Musa Mayer there on the left, and it's about a 6-hour online course anyone can take. I think over 15,000 people have taken it. So it introduces you to the language of evidence-based healthcare. And then these women here on the right are a very interesting group, because they're all from Baltimore and Washington, and they took Project LEAD, and they said, well, we want to continue learning more. And so they came to my office at University of Maryland once a month. We read papers together and critiqued them. And they said, well, we want to do a systematic review. And a medical student really started them off, and they did one on prophylactic mastectomy and whether that would be useful to women diagnosed with breast cancer. And they're continuing that to update that review for the Cochrane Collaboration. And it's an all-advocate authored review. And they've got hundreds of studies, no clinical trials, all observational studies. And so it's a really interesting group. Anyway, the other thing that was important here was with the National Breast Cancer Coalition, we started a research program that was funded by the Department of Defense. And now they have 21 different programs in cancer, prostate cancer. I'm sure some of you are funded by them. And the origins, I'm happy to talk to people about the origins of this. Very interesting. They really didn't want consumers to vote, but we wanted consumers to be part of the grant review process, and they are. So as long as, in those days, the consumers were trained by Project Lead. And the first program was really started because the head of the NIH at that time was the person who stood against our daycare. Michael will remember that meeting with her. That was an incredible meeting. She was here at Johns Hopkins first and then became head of the NIH. She said, "We've done enough for women. We don't need to have any more research." And so here were all these Vietnam protesters, and we put the money in the Army. They had a small breast cancer research program, mostly developing and related to mammography. And so we weren't starting from scratch. But anyway, they were wonderful to work with. We expected to hate them. We loved them. They were great. And so some of the story is on their website. The Institute of Medicine was asked by the DOD to say, well, how should this happen, since they were given $300 million for this program? And it's a very interesting group of people, included Harold Varmus and Mary Claire King, for those of you who know some of those people. And we have a paper on what it was like to, we have two papers on what it was like to include consumers as voters in the grant review process. And now, as I said, the DOD has, I think, 21 or 27 different programs where they give out research money. So it's really led to a lot. And Q then has developed from this work with the National Breast Cancer Coalition. The idea was that one of the things I saw as part of this advocacy world was that they don't have what all of us have in terms of going to meetings and networking with people and learning, essentially, hearing talks, learning about, because they were so worried about, it appeared to me, their money. And, oh, you know, if they have a run, because we raise a lot of money doing a run, we might lose out and have less money next year. And yet, these meetings are so important. So we wanted to have a group like what we had in science, where consumers could gather. Have we had an impact? I hope so. So consumer education in science is believed to be important now. And their emphasis on the research evidence, we can always hope. And they do keep up to date using social media, and we do too. And engaging consumers in research, and PCORI is doing this, and to advocate for those opportunities where consumers can fit in. And I know Susan Love said at the very beginning of National Breast Cancer Coalition, she said, we don't want to just have a bake sale. We want to actually sit at the table to make these decisions, not just raise the money, but to actually be there. And in those days, bake sales were what women did. Okay, friends, very important, and collaborators, some of whom become collaborators. And at first I was sort of disappointed that my friends were my collaborators as well, and then I realized, why not? This is great. So here's a story. There are only 4 of us here, because there were 5 of us who went to get a massage. That's how many fit in the car. But there were more, probably 10 of us. They were women epidemiologists, and they worked in the government at Hopkins and Maryland, and we met monthly for 8 years. When we began, we met twice a month, and our whole goal was to just talk about work. But we started with gossip, because we said one of the problems is that women don't know what the gossip is. That is, the gossip like, is Bernadine Healy leaving NIH or what? And we also did massages together. And then one of the topics that came up was being peer reviewers. And some of you can identify with this, I'm sure, is how much is the right amount? Do I do 2 a month, 1 a month, 4 a month? What's the right amount? It takes a lot of time, and you do it for free. And then one of the women in our group said, well, I review all the time for this journal, but this guy down the hall was chosen to be an associate editor. So how come I wasn't chosen? I'm told my reviews are good. What's going on? So we did a little study to see whether there was any bias in choosing editors for epidemiology journals. And it took us a long time because it was unfunded. But that was a study that came out of friendship and friendship because we had started out as collaborators. And now Riaz Kourssi, he's doing a study on women epidemiologists as editorial author. So things don't get lost, they continue, depending on people's interests. So this is another friendship and collaboration. It really started out as a collaboration. This was the first meeting of the Cochrane Collaboration in 1993. And basically, Ian Chalmers, who's way in the back, you can't even see him, he really called the first meeting, and he called together his friends. So there was 70 people from 9 countries, and really it was a social movement of people who wanted practice to be based on research. And now, 25 years later, we're all friends and collaborators. And I'd say that the work of the collaboration, which is largely done volunteer, and if you can get a grant, more power to you, it's recognized globally for producing this unbiased evidence and keeping it up to date. And we're funded by the National Eye Institute to do Eyes and Vision reviews, and some of our collaborators are here today, so it's nice to see you. So make sure you talk and listen to others, and I always say talk, talk, talk. So I'll tell you a story. I said that I was gone for 4 years, and that was Bob decided it was no good being a mathematician, and I was in epidemiology. He'd go to medical school. So, okay. And we had 2 kids, so there's no choice, but we were going to be together. So anyway, I was down here. I was staying with Barbara Hawkins because I wanted to finish up my preliminary orals before I moved to Boston. And she had at that time, and she's just had knee surgery, by the way. She's doing all right, but she's not here today. Anyway, she used to have an annual New Year's Eve party, and it was all-day open house. I don't know how she did it. And Leon Gordis, who was the chair of our department there, was there, and we were talking. He said, "How do you like Boston?" And I said, "Oh, Bob's just gotten this bone box. It's got all the bones of the body. I can't imagine anything more deadly." And he said, "Well, I think that sounds pretty interesting." I thought, "Oh, okay, we're all different." And we are all different. So it was then that I realized, well, you know, I'm an epidemiologist because that's what I am. And he was a doctor first and became an epidemiologist. And it's interesting, I haven't figured this one out yet. Maybe some of you, like Michael, can tell me, is why do so many pediatricians become epidemiologists? I'd really like to know. Anyway, it's very important, and I was at a meeting and met Ilana Lowy in Boston, and she's in Paris. She's from Paris, and she works on reproductive medicine, and she does anthropology. And she said to me, "I always ask my students to read An Instance of the Finger Post." Has anyone here read it? It's really worth reading. Good. Moises. And I read it, of course, immediately, and what it is, it's about a woman getting hanged, a murder, and you think you understand it from the first person telling you the story, and then each of about 5 people tell the story completely differently. And it's very interesting that way. It's a long book, and for those of you who don't like to read, it might be a bit of a slog, but it's worth reading if you do like to read, because it does demonstrate perspective. And then I was at my mother's 90th birthday not that long ago, and I was talking to the husband of her best friend, so he's close to 90 himself. And he was talking about this journal, which shall remain unnamed, that I like a lot. And he said, I don't really like it. And I was like, what's going on? Because the journals that he likes, I don't really like that much, and I really like this one. And so then Riaz and I wrote an editorial that really talked about the different views of research and of research evidence. So this journal that he really wasn't so fond of does a lot of statistics and educating doctors about statistics. It's a journal for doctors. And it's interesting, this different point of view. So are we talking just to ourselves, or are we actually going to have an effect? Are we talking to have an effect? And that's really important to me, but how can we have an effect and still retain who we are? And that's, I think, the central question. So I like this picture because it shows, it's from China, it shows a lot of painters who are all pretty good, and they're painting the same model, all the same and yet different. So the guy always has a beard, but the beard's a different color, or it might be emphasized differently. The curls might be emphasized, the hat he's wearing, and we see things differently. Those of you who are from families know you can remember the same incident and you see it entirely differently. So, and that's real. That's not, no one's right, no one's wrong. It's just different. And I think we have to respect one another's vision and perspective to be able to try to work towards solving it. Okay, experiencing. And this is really important because it's so easy as you get more and more senior to just sit in your chair. But the first experience I remember, maybe Joe Canner can remember this, it was when we were working on the glaucoma laser trial, and they took us over to Wilmer, and in those days there were two big machines that measured visual field. One was the Humphrey, which is still in use, and the glaucoma laser trial used an octopus, which is not, I don't know if it's in use at all, but it's not very popular anyway. Anyway, I said, well, I'd like to have my visual field done. And the way that works, that's your peripheral vision. It tests your central and your peripheral vision, and you press a little clicker every time you see a dot. And it makes you really nervous because you don't want to press it if it isn't going off, and sometimes it's quite faint. And you don't want to not press it when the red light is going on because you want to see perfectly. So at the end of 40 minutes, I had done one eye, and I was exhausted. And I was probably in my 30s at this point. And so I thought, well, how do you do this visual field when you're an older person? I was exhausted because I didn't want to be wrong. And it's 40 minutes, just one eye. And so that really taught me a lot for going forward is you can't just, as clinical trialists, you can't just say, well, they're going to do this and this and this without thinking that the patient and the person participating is having an experience that you need to take into account, like driving to the doctor's and finding a parking place. That's not small. So the visual fields, having that experience was very important. Design data collection forms, get involved and see that, and not just for training your students, but for keeping yourself up to date with, are we asking one question as we want to, or are we really asking two questions here? And what's the best way to ask it? Collect data yourself. And I'll show you a slide from my 2003 sabbatical where I was with a group that did individual participant meta-analysis where they look at data that are sent to them by trialists so that they can put them all together in a meta-analysis. And they only collected, less than 10 variables. And yet I saw how different each variable was. Ask if it's a man. Well, you might be 0-1, you might be 1-2, you might be man, MF. Everyone collects it a different way. And that's why when you talk about open science or whatever, it's not as easy as it sounds. Any of you who work with data and get the data from the original researcher know that this is the hardest part, maybe. Is getting all that data together and finding someone who can do it. And Jimmy Lay's running a project where we faculty are verifying the systematic reviews to see whether the information collected on them, they're reliable. Well, what does reliable mean? We're defining reliable. What is it? And we're going to get people mad if we say their systematic reviews aren't reliable. Is that justifiable? Are we okay with that? So again, I think it's very important that you get involved in doing it yourself so that you aren't just telling other people what to do. And I'm showing you here data collection on my thesis. It was in those days we had cubicles. I inherited Sukhan's cubicle, which was the biggest one in the school. I think it was, he had a bed in there, but I had filing cabinets, and 4 of us worked in there. So that was really collecting data. Maintain balance. So this is the balance in your life, right? And we talk about a work-life balance, and I've already said it's all one. I don't separate them. So, but the balance I'm encouraging you to have is the balance between being creative and being formulaic, which we have to do sometimes, having fun, living a life, having a life. And so some of it's Hopkins, and this was a Hopkins party, which is fun, and we were drinking wine, that's fun. Cochrane, and within Cochrane we have Women in Cochrane, so you can see the stiletto sign there. The Peer Review Congress has been a wonderful place for both friends and science to join together. And doing laundry, that's real. I found this picture because there were a whole bunch of pictures from Lifetime TV from years ago about picture what women do on their other life. And so there were pictures of me running a meeting, which we all see plenty of, and then also doing laundry. So I thought, well, that's real. Going to the Women's March. This is a high school friend. We used to campaign together for McGovern way back when. This is from the Peer Review Congress. These are a lot of our friends who gather together at the, maybe you recognize some of them, at the Peer Review Congress. We happen to be together. The farmers market, which I go to, and I hope some of you do, every week. I've been going since before it was under the highway. Noticing beauty. This is our neighborhood. Having parties. This is our dog when I graduated. And this is a party too. Some of you may remember Trudy Bush and Penny Kyle, a party at our house. I think Peter Burney took that. And sabbatical. Let me encourage you all to take sabbaticals. Whether you're at that point or not, you will be someday. And I've learned a lot, and I've had a lot of fun also. So the first sabbatical I took in 2003, I split it. It was 6 months, and I split it between going to JAMA and learning how they actually do peer review and talking about registration of trials. We got 2 papers out of that. Then going to France, where this is Jean-Pierre Pignon, and he's doing the individual participant meta-analysis in cancer. And then in 2016, going back and working with the French Cochrane Center in their place, really, next to Notre Dame. It's pretty shocking. And of course, enjoying Luxembourg Garden, my favorite. And they're always on strike, I forgot to mention. So, this is part of that maintaining balance that is really hard to find, is how often do I say yes and how often do I say no. And there I go to other people for their opinions as well as my own. And Kurt Meinert said around 1980, if you're invited to a social occasion with a work colleague, say yes. And I think that's pretty important advice. And he said, and this is another chair of my department at University of Maryland, Paul Stoley. He said, I had been offered to go look for a job, and he said, always look at another position, unless you're absolutely positive you won't go. At the very worst, you will find out that you value your current job, and which is true. So I thought that was a yes. And a no, Steve Goodman gave me the most important instructions. I just used it last weekend too, about when to say no to an invitation to go out of town. And he said he has a list of rules. And so my son, who's now an academic, our son, he said, I've got these meetings, they're back to back, and we're interviewing candidates, what should I do? And I said, make a list of what your rules are, and then you'll see what to do. And he made a list, and it was obvious what to do. So he did it anyway. It was hard, but I think that really helps. What are your rules? And I would say if I've seen any mistakes, I think younger people have to say yes more often than older people. Besides, we get tired. Pay attention to everything that's happening elsewhere. In the old days, Welsh Library, you'd walk in, and on the left side now where they have receptions and so forth, they had all the journals, and you could just sit down and I could read neurology and anything I wanted. It was a wonderful way to bring other fields into your own field. We don't have that anymore. So if you can find a way, whatever that system is, read outside your field, because you'll get ideas for your own field. You'll see what they're doing. I talk to everyone in elevators, whatever. Call them on the phone. You'll learn something. And sometimes it's surprising what you learn. And social media, I hope some of you are tweeting, is a way to learn also. So this is a picture that I had. I couldn't find them, and finally I did. They were hidden away. In the old days, how many people here remember current contents? Oh, good. So in the old days, we would get these in our office, and then you'd mark. It was a picture of the table of contents of all the big journals. This is clinical medicine. And these are Tom Chalmers, and he actually kept them in his bathroom. So it's what he would do in the bathroom. But anyway, it was interesting looking at the markings, because it was expensive to subscribe, and he shared it with people, and you could see what he marked that he wanted, and this is, I think, 1984, something like that. And he marked everything that was meta-analysis and systematic reviews, way before clinical medicine was interested. But we don't have, well, it turns out current contents does still exist, but we don't get it anyway. But you can get the table of contents filling up your inbox all the time. This is JAMA Ophthalmology, and I have to say I like paper copy, but I also get paper of this. And you can look at the paper at the library, but probably mostly online. You can tweet, and it's a way to find out what people are reading. I think it's a great way. And I was sitting at a lunch at the IOM, I don't know, like about 2 or 3 years ago, next to someone. I said, well, I get all these great papers and Twitter, but then what do I do? And she said, put it in Pocket, which is an app, and then you can put the paper in Pocket so you can read it later on. And I just showed that to Sean Grant at Evan and Larissa's wedding, and he had all these open papers on his phone. I thought, it's terrible. You should use Pocket. So I hope you will. It is a great way to read it, and you can read it on your main computer then, or print it out, however you want to read it. But I keep it on my phone where I do Twitter. So we have some other methods now, and I have to say I liked the old method, but we don't have it. So get with the program. Okay, and then my last risk factor is don't choose your work because you like the work. Choose the work because you like the people. And I'll never forget the first year I was at Society for Epidemiologic Research. They had a student scholarship workshop or something, and you presented your thesis proposal to other faculty, and then they critiqued it. And it was in Utah, and all the students went out to dinner that night, and one of the people said to me, who was a student in epidemiology at another university, she said, I just like to organize so much. And I thought, wow, me too. And so it was interesting. We weren't talking about epidemiology. We were talking about how do you have all this stuff, how do you organize it? I thought, that's very interesting, because that was what I really needed to know at that. There's no question I liked epidemiology. It was the right field for me. But also we could talk about how do you do it with these people. So this is our department, and these are the people I like. And as I say to my kids and anyone who will listen, if you're lucky, life is long, and you better like the people you work with. So these are the risk factors I've gone through that were important to me. And these are the key themes that you may not have pulled out, but I pulled out for you. Be who you are and make it part of your work. And be open to other perspectives, enriching your own thinking, and then translate the epidemiology that you do so that it can have an impact, your work can have an impact. And we aren't just doing research for ourselves. So I want to thank everyone, especially those of you who introduced me so kindly and who came today. That's wonderful. And as I said in my thesis, thank you, and that means you, and I do mean you. And these are some of the people we work with in our halls. And then I love this. It was a card that we found, and it says, be the kind of woman that when your feet hit the floor each morning, the devil says, oh crap, she's up.